Marcus Rashford is someone who I talk about a lot on this channel, and I suppose that is unsurprising. He has been a star man for Manchester United and a full England international since the age of 18. During that time, there have been some extraordinary Marcus Rashford moments, whether that be his breakthrough, where he scored braces against FC Midtjylland and Arsenal, followed by the winner in the Manchester derby, his stunning hat-trick off the bench against RB Leipzig in the Champions League, or that famous penalty which he calmly dispatched under immense pressure against PSG. For some people though, all of Marcus Rashford's accomplishments on the pitch, of which there are many, even only at the tender age of 24, have been outweighed by his work off it. Over the last couple of years, Rashford has given a voice to the voiceless, it could be said, campaigning on behalf of some of the poorest communities, families and children in the United Kingdom. Rashford himself, like most footballers, grew up in a working-class household. One of 5 siblings raised by a single parent, Rashford's mother Melanie worked multiple jobs to support her children and still had to skip meals herself to ensure that they would be fed. As such, Rashford and his siblings relied on free school meals, a means-tested support system for children from very low-income families in the United Kingdom. Now Rashford is both enormously rich and famous. He earns more in a month than his mother could likely ever have dreamed of earning in an entire lifetime. Of course, Rashford could just enjoy his newfound wealth and support those closest to him. But instead, he has chosen to campaign on behalf of those who now find themselves in a situation reminiscent of the one that he grew up in. Rashford's campaigning has been hugely successful. He topped the Sunday Times giving list for 2021, he forced the UK government into 2 humiliating U-turns in 2020, and a recent poll carried out by Ipsos Mori found that Rashford was the 3rd most popular celebrity in Britain out of the candidates that they gave people the chance to vote on, trailing only David Attenborough and the Queen. And he has done all of this whilst continuing to be one of England's finest footballers. But this season, Rashford's form has faltered. He has been in and out of the Manchester United team, he has looked off the pace at times, and he has only managed to score 5 goals in 17 games so far this term. As such, questions have started to be asked regarding his struggles. One answer that I recently read published online by a fairly high-profile magazine, and has been echoed by a lot of people on social media, is that Rashford has been distracted. He let the acclaim go to his head, he became too focused on off-field issues, and his football is suffering as a consequence. So today, I wanted to take a look at that theory, see where it originated from, and most of all, whether there is any truth to it. Before I begin this video proper, I just want to provide a trigger warning for anyone who has difficulties with the mingling of football and politics, because it is impossible to talk about Marcus Rashford's campaigning without acknowledging the political aspect of it. So, if that is likely to be problematic for you, I would advise switching off at this point just in case, and I would recommend a recent video that I made looking at the greatest Premier League centre-backs of all time, which, I can assure you, is not political in the slightest. With that being said, this is a video about Marcus Rashford's form, so we ought to begin by actually taking a look at that form. As I said in the introduction, Rashford has only scored 5 goals in 17 games this season, which is his worst output at this stage of a season since the 2016-17 campaign. It ought to be said that Rashford hasn't started an awful lot of those 17 games. He missed the first 2 months of the season with a shoulder injury, and he has had a couple of niggling injuries since then. If you were to reframe that statistic, for example, as Rashford has had better than 1 goal contribution per 2 full 90 minutes this season, things don't sound quite so bad. But I do think Rashford has looked sluggish and underwhelming in a number of Manchester United games this season, so I'm not going to let him off the hook that easily. Rashford is one of only a small number of players within the English game to have hit 20 plus goals in each of the last 2 seasons, managing to maintain his impressive goal-scoring record even after Bruno Fernandes was brought in and subsequently took over penalty-taking duties. For context, Riyad Mahrez, Heung-min Son, Raheem Sterling and Sadio Mane all failed to hit 20 goals in each of the last 2 seasons. And when you put it like that, the narrative that Rashford has been overhyped and overrated appears to be rather ludicrous. And one might even suggest that the opposite is true. In the first half of last season, Rashford averaged close to 1 goal contribution per game, which is a record that only Mohamed Salah can boast so far this term. During the second half of the season, Rashford was still the second most important productive player for Manchester United within the final third, behind only Bruno Fernandes, but there was a definite drop-off. We now know for certain, and it did seem pretty obvious to most people at the time, that Rashford was carrying an injury. Indeed, whilst Manchester United tried their best to keep it under wraps at the time, we now know that Rashford was actually injured for 11 months prior to Euro 2020. Meaning the entirety of the 2020-21 campaign, in which he still managed to score 21 goals and make 15 assists. Rashford suffered a shoulder injury in September 2020, which would ultimately require surgery. But after successfully playing through the pain at the start of the campaign, Rashford found that the pain became more and more intense as the season went on, and as he was afforded no time for rest or recuperation. In spite of his shoulder injury and what had become excruciating pain that made it difficult for him to train by the latter stages of the campaign, Rashford still played an incredible 62 times for club and country across the course of the season. Only 9 players in Europe's top 5 leagues played more games last season. When analysing Marcus Rashford's recent struggles, I think it makes more sense to start by looking at the amount of games that he has played, and the number of games that he has played whilst injured, before we turn our attention to any issues off the pitch. It is very rarely acknowledged just how much football Marcus Rashford has played for a man of his age. Having only turned 24 around 10 weeks ago, Rashford has already played 333 games within the senior professional game at the time of this recording. 287 of those appearances coming for Manchester United, and the other 46 for England. After spending far too much time looking into this and adding up the numbers for other players, I could only find a handful who had played an equal or greater number of games than Rashford at his age. Even Michael Owen, who I would say is the greatest teenage starlet English football has produced, during my lifetime at least, didn't play as much football in his first 5 seasons as Rashford. When you combine games played for both club and country, Rashford has made more than 50 appearances in a single season 5 times already. By comparison, Gary Neville, Paul Scholes and David Beckham only ever did that 4 times across their entire careers. Rashford, just as a reminder, only turned 24 at the end of October. His numbers, for a man of his age, are just absurd, and almost without precedent within the English game. Many of you will recall that, until probably midway through last season, Manchester City and Pep Guardiola were often criticised for not giving Phil Foden sufficient game time. I always thought that this was a bit of a daft criticism that wasn't really rooted in fact, given that Foden played a lot of football in a fantastic team for a man of his age. And in truth, I think he probably played an ideal number of minutes to aid his development over the last 4 or 5 seasons. Rashford, on the other hand, has not been managed, so to speak, like Phil Foden has. There has been no strategy in terms of when and where to play him, how to best develop him, and when to rest him. It has just been a case of, well, we desperately need 3 points or a win, Rashford is good, so we best play him. And that has been the case virtually every week, and often twice in the space of a week, for more than 5 years. A lot of people dismiss the idea of player welfare, including Sean Dyche in a recent press conference, but the reality is that no amount of money, no amount of ice baths, and no amount of nutritionists, dietitians, and personal trainers can prevent relentless high-intensity exercise from taking its toll on a body. Footballers, as it has often been said, could play a 90-minute game of football every single day. Of course they could, but inevitably, they would get incredibly tired, performance levels would drop, and the number of injuries each team sustained would increase. That is the real tale of what we have seen in the case of Marcus Rashford. A player who has played more football than just about anyone his age, has set expectations extremely high, has played through an injury for 11 months, undergone surgery to belatedly try and put that injury right, and is now just attempting to get back into the swing of things following that setback. I certainly think that Manchester United are culpable in the poor way in which Rashford's development has been managed, and I think it is a problem which extends well beyond him alone. Jack Grealish is almost exactly 2 years older than Rashford, yet he has played 41 games fewer than the Manchester United man. Trent Alexander-Arnold, who it seems as though broke through extremely young and has played virtually every week since, is almost exactly 1 year younger than Rashford, but has played 115 games fewer than him. In other words, Jack Grealish has averaged 32.4 games a season since making his debut. Trent Alexander-Arnold has averaged 36.3 games, and Marcus Rashford has averaged a staggering 47.5 games played per season since making his Manchester United debut. That is 15 games a season more than Grealish, and over 10 games a season more than Trent. The reason for this, aside from Rashford just having been very good and very consistent since a very young age, is that Manchester United managers have constantly been under pressure to get results in order to keep their jobs. As such, short-term thinking has prevailed at the club for the best part of a decade. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, I am absolutely sure, knew that the best course of action for Marcus Rashford last season, individually, would have been for him to rest or undergo surgery in order to make a full recovery from his shoulder injury. But Manchester United needed results, so Rashford's development was a secondary concern. What's more, unlike, say, Phil Foden, Trent Alexander-Arnold, or other youngsters at other top clubs, Rashford is rarely afforded the luxury of being able to coast through games. In addition to playing far fewer games, Foden and Trent both play in teams that routinely dominate possession and suffocate their opponents. Manchester United do still win a lot of games, relatively speaking, but they are rarely in absolute control, meaning Rashford has spent most of his 300-plus appearances within the senior game playing at a very high intensity. In Marcus Rashford, Mason Greenwood, Anthony Martial, Luke Shaw, and even, I would say, Adnan Januzaj, Manchester United have had some outstanding teenage footballers at the club since Sir Alex Ferguson retired. But none of them, I would argue, have been properly managed to maximise their potential. And of the lot, Marcus Rashford has still enjoyed by far the most success to date. So why, when there is seemingly such an obvious explanation for Rashford's struggles over what is, let's face it, only really a pretty short period of time, is there such a fixation on something else, and something which seems quite far removed and to have very little correlation to his performances out on the pitch? Well, to answer that, I think we have to broaden our scope a little, beyond the world of football, and take a look almost at a timeline of Marcus Rashford's off-field activities. Marcus Rashford's campaigning, for want of a better word, could be said to have begun in October 2019, on an issue which was entirely unrelated to free school meals. The previous Christmas, Rashford had gone out and bought a load of essential items with his family, putting them in boxes and handing them out at homeless shelters. In 2019, fresh off the back of signing his first mega contract at Old Trafford, the Manchester United forward wanted to see if he could do a bit more than that, so he contacted 4 homeless charities in Manchester and asked them whether they would be willing to help him roll out these Christmas boxes on a larger scale. The campaign was called In the Box, and Rashford asked members of the public to help out by filling shoeboxes with essential items like toothpaste, hand sanitizer, hats, gloves, shampoo, and all the other things that might come in handy for those living out on the streets. The campaign didn't attract a great deal of media attention, and Rashford was said to have been disappointed by its limited impact. Albeit, the campaign did still result in 1,200 boxes full of essential items being given to homeless people who otherwise wouldn't have received them. Oddly enough, one of the few people to report on this more limited and local campaign orchestrated by Rashford, who had just turned 22 at the time, was Rob Dawson at ESPN, who tweeted about it, and one of the small number of responses read, "Should be focusing on his football." That tweet received only 5 likes and 10 incredulous responses, which is known in the world of Twitter as getting ratioed, but it would foreshadow some of the discourse around Marcus Rashford that was to follow. And then came March 2020, and the first of the UK's significant COVID-19 related restrictions. At this point, 2 things happened that are relevant here. One is that all football stopped, and the other is that schools closed. The first meant that Rashford had more time on his hands than he typically would have, and the second meant that kids who depended on free school meals were at risk of being forced to go without, along with any free meals that they might have been provided with at community centres or breakfast clubs, all of which were forced to shut down. It was at that point that Rashford partnered with FareShare, the UK-wide charity that seeks to relieve poverty primarily by obtaining goods from supermarkets that would have gone to waste and redistributing those goods to people and families across the country who need them most. Rashford had initially reached out to FareShare because he just wanted to make a private donation to support them, but his involvement would end up going much further than that. At this point, Rashford's campaign attracted a fair amount of attention on social media and donations from the public, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. I was actually a little bit surprised looking back at his tweets to see a fair few critical and abusive messages, but they were very much restricted to the fringes. It was in June 2020 when Rashford wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister, Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, and his campaign became political, in inverted commas, that a more critical eye from certain sections of the English establishment began to be cast on his activism. A day after Rashford shared his open letter on social media, the government performed a screeching U-turn, deciding that they would, after all, feed hungry children outside of term time. But the young England international wasn't done there. I said in a video not long after this, maybe 15 to 18 months ago, that certain sections of the British press would be sharpening their swords and digging up dirt on Marcus Rashford at that point. The British press, and in truth, specifically the English press, since these things are a little bit different in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, have a long track record of building up young people only to knock them down. It is vicious and unkind, but it's not particularly ideologically motivated. It's just a fun game for the hacks to play, and it sells copies. We saw this with Paul Gascoigne, David Beckham, Wayne Rooney, and countless other England internationals, typically intensifying in the build-up to and immediate fallout from major international tournaments. The difference with Rashford, in many cases, is that he was being built up not because it was a fun game for the journalist in England to play, based on his footballing achievements, whilst gearing up to give him a good kicking when the time was right, but because anything other than praise would have seemed immediately bizarre to most of the general public. Marcus Rashford has 5.3 million followers on Twitter, which is 1.5 million followers more than Boris Johnson. He has a direct line of communication with his audience, and he doesn't need to filter his message via Lord Rothermere, Rupert Murdoch, or any of Britain's small number of major newspaper proprietors. Given that Rashford's campaign was incredibly popular and incredibly straightforward, that is to say, basically, that children shouldn't go without food simply because they were born into low-income households, it was very difficult to sell this as anything other than, young lad does a really nice thing. So the newspapers reluctantly went along for the ride, a bit like me at Hull Fair, but all the while, they were just waiting for their moment. I said at the time that as soon as Rashford hit a sticky patch of form, we will hear how his philanthropy, while sweet and all, and it's nice that fewer kids are starving, was actually a really bad thing, because he's paid to play football, and that means that a single second spent not playing or thinking about football is likely to send him into some kind of perilous death spiral of wretched form, culminating in an early retirement. This claim was actually tried out a few times, particularly on social media, but unfortunately, most of the hacks at English newspapers aren't just nasty, they're also quite thick, and they don't tend to know much about football. Consequently, they jumped the gun and went far too early, claiming that Activism was impacting Rashford's form, whilst he was actually in really good form. Indeed, Rashford's form actually improved after his free school meals campaign began. When some restrictions were lifted and football returned in the 2019-20 season, Rashford notched 7 goal contributions in only 8 games. Good luck trying to convince anyone that campaigning was damaging Rashford's form at that point. So then they got desperate. They couldn't attack Rashford on footballing grounds because his football was flourishing, and every time they tried that, people pointed that fact out. The next attempt was to point out that Rashford had bought some houses. Here is the Daily Mail with the headline, "What a result! Campaigning football star Marcus Rashford has bought 5 luxury homes worth more than £2 million. It is worth noting that the average house price in Cheshire, where at least 3 of those properties were based, is £449,620, and the average value of the 5 properties that Rashford bought was £400,000, meaning that those luxury homes were, in fact, probably just normal homes, but that is a side issue. You will notice that they describe Rashford in the headline as a campaigning football star, attempting to juxtapose his campaigning with buying 5 houses worth a combined £2 million. The headline and the tone of the entire article was pretty explicit in its inference. Rashford is a hypocrite. He wants poor children to be fed, yet he's paid £2 million for 5 properties. Of course, Rashford has never campaigned for an end to property investment or some kind of Maoist land reform movement and a purging of landlords. He's just campaigned for vulnerable kids to be fed outside of term time. But give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So Rashford must be punished. Nonetheless, this extremely thinly veiled attempt to smear Rashford didn't even wash with most Daily Mail readers, who could see straight through it. Next up came an attempt to besmirch Rashford on the grounds that he had hired a PR firm. Of course, virtually everyone in the world with a profile as large as Rashford's employs some kind of PR firm at this stage, but Rashford was pretty uniquely singled out on account of this fact. In December 2020, the online magazine Unheard, which was founded by Boris Johnson's former special advisor Tim Montgomery, ran a story which was entitled "Who's Behind Marcus Rashford?" Usually Fred and Scott McTominay came the inevitable responses on social media, but the author of the piece was suggesting something rather more cynical. The article attempted to suggest, not for the first time, that Rashford must have some kind of ulterior motive, and that wanting impoverished children who are reliant on free school meals for basic nutritional needs, just as he was growing up, to be slightly less impoverished and a bit better fed, well, he must really be doing that for self-promotion. You see, to these people, and I use the word people very loosely in this sentence, the idea of doing anything, and I really do mean anything, to benefit people who are worse off than yourself is such an alien concept, so contrary to their own worldview, that it cannot be genuine. It must be part of some great big deception. Otherwise, what's the point? Later on, the article attempted to group Rashford's free school meals campaign in with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Premier League's Rainbow Laces campaign, so as to try and create a big scary woke monster just smashing his way through football, trying to force basic sustenance for children, anti-racism, and tolerance of LGBT people on everyone. Yeah, alright. Doesn't sound quite so bad when you put it like that, but to some people, that is a terrifying thought. One which would stop some Unheard readers from getting a good night's sleep for weeks. Of course, Rashford's campaigning has primarily been around child poverty, education, and particularly free school meals. It has never been divided down lines of race or sexuality. At no point has Marcus Rashford said, "We demand free school meals, but only for black kids." But rather, he has demanded it for all kids who need them, the majority of whom, in the United Kingdom, are white. The whole Rock Nation, Jay-Z, woke monster story was a little bit more effective than, hey look, he bought some houses despite saying that children shouldn't starve. But it still didn't really wash with most people, hence why he was voted the 3rd most popular person in Britain, as I alluded to in the introduction, just last month. But it was never going to stop there. And Rashford's first major lapse in form since his campaigning began roughly 2 years ago has presented a golden opportunity to sling a bit more mud in his general direction. His penalty miss in the Euro 2020 final would have been the newspaper editors and writers' wet dream were it not for all of the bad racism making it difficult for them to be anything other than begrudgingly charitable towards him, so as not to come across as unabashedly nasty psychopaths who pumped out that very racism into the airwaves in the first place. Indeed, Tory MP Natalie Elphicke still couldn't help herself from criticising Rashford, even in the midst of all of the bad racism, sending a leaked private message which read, "They lost. Would it be ungenerous to say Rashford should have spent more time perfecting his game and less time playing politics," in a group chat to her Conservative Party colleagues? Elphicke, who encouraged Rashford to stay in his lane and stick to football, was rather ironically implicated in the recent second job scandal, suggesting that maybe she isn't the best person to be offering advice on sticking to your day job. The reality is that there is absolutely no reason to believe that Marcus Rashford's campaigning has had any negative effect on his performances whatsoever. Indeed, even if correlation did automatically equate to causation, which It quite obviously doesn't. The only inference we could actually draw is that the more Marcus Rashford campaigns, the better he plays, and the more goals he scores. Meanwhile, the more the England national team become involved in social movements, the better they perform at major tournaments. What often gets overlooked is the fact that footballers, at least at Premier League level, tend to be young men with lots of money and lots of time on their hands. Historically, that is a combination that has ended up with some pretty bad outcomes, unsurprisingly. The modern generation of footballers are the most professional and the most committed that we have ever seen. But there are only so many hours that you can train within a day, week, month and year, and with increasingly congested fixture schedules, players are being asked to take rest days even more often, resulting in even more free time. Some players spend their free time playing video games, some take up golf, and some advertise buying JPEGs of apes to children. That was a joke, before the NFT bros come after me in the comments. Though I must say, I do think it is pretty reckless shilling an extremely high-risk investment as a multi-millionaire athlete to a very young and likely significantly less wealthy and impressionable audience. Anyhow, Marcus Rashford spends his free time campaigning around child poverty. Even if you take a heartless approach to this, from a solely footballing perspective, with a dispassionate view of whether children should be fed or not, from the perspective of Manchester United, there are few better ways that Marcus Rashford could be spending his free time. He's not out drinking, gambling, or causing trouble, all of which may be far more fun, but aren't necessarily very beneficial or conducive to his development as a footballer. But rather, he has found a passion project which seems extremely fulfilling and rewarding for him. It might be a bit stressful at times, I suppose, given the gravity of what he's campaigning for, but that is probably the most damning claim that you can make against it. It is worth remembering that a large number of the stick to football and keep politics out of football crowd who are currently arrowing in on Rashford are the same people who said that if England players took the knee at Euro 2020, they would go out in the group stage shortly before Gareth Southgate's side reached their first final of a major tournament in 55 years. It must be said that many of the big brain pundits in England, as they like to see themselves, most of whom actually played ruggers at school, not football, could write down just about everything that they know about football on a grain of sand, whilst using a Sharpie pen. There is a certain degree of irony that the same people who say Marcus Rashford doesn't have anything to do with his campaigning, it's all just a PR firm doing it as a publicity stunt to raise his profile, who also wish to portray the 24-year-old's indifferent recent form as being caused by his preoccupation with his campaigning, which has taken his focus away from football. Do you see the problem? You can't have it both ways. So no, Marcus Rashford's campaigning is not damaging his form. When the Manchester United players arrive at training, Ralph Rangnick doesn't assign them all training drills, whilst telling Rashford to, just hang back and read up on some Gandhi and Martin Luther King and their methods of political protest. If anything, it is actually too much focus on football and not enough rest, which are responsible for Rashford's struggles this season. It could be argued, quite easily I think, that even if Marcus Rashford's campaigning did detract from his performances, it would be more than worth it. But there is simply no evidence to suggest that is the case. For what it's worth, and as badly as he has been developed, I still think Marcus Rashford is destined to have a lengthy career at the very highest level, assuming he doesn't sustain any really serious or recurring injury setbacks. He is too good and too committed to the sport for that not to be the case. Indeed, since I actually wrote most of that video, Rashford did score a last-minute winner against West Ham, and the narrative has already started to shift. So, he's proving me right already. That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much from the bottom of my heart for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts as ever down below in the comments. And make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.